Meeting concerns a review of recommended budget adjustments for fiscal year 2009. Mr. Pearson, would you like to lead us through this, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Good morning. Bob Pearson, Finance Director. And this is the culmination of the Finance Committee's budget review process for the recommended fiscal year 2009 budget. As you know, the committee has been reviewing the budget since shortly after the April 15th filing date and has spent some time reviewing a number of items related to the budget. And today's agenda is essentially to formulate the committee's recommendations to the full council, and then the budget will come back to the full council on, I think it's June 24th, without my calendar. I think that's a Tuesday, for adoption. And so we really have two sections, if you will, of the meeting today. As you have seen from your council agenda report in the packet, we do have a number, 6 to be specific, of what we refer to as staff recommended adjustments. Those adjustments reflect changes or things that have arisen since the April 15th filing date of the budget, and we're going to go through those momentarily. After we go through those, I think staff would recommend that the committee if you have any questions on those staff recommended adjustments, we'd ask you to consider those, and we'll be ready to respond to any questions, and then we would look for the committee to make a recommendation on those as a group or individually, and then we would plan to turn it over to the committee to solicit any comments, suggestions, or proposed changes that you might wish to consider as part of your recommendation to the full council. So if that sounds acceptable.
Sounds good. Committee members, any questions at this point? If not, then why don't you start through it?
We will. And there we go, Bob. Bob's going to put up on the overhead the a summary schedule that was included in the agenda packet of the staff recommended adjustments, and I'm going to go through them. There we go. They're broken down by fund, of course, as usual. And we'll start with the general fund. The first of the general fund on the schedule that you see is a reduction to the mayor and council's budget of $19,093, and that is as a result of the reduction that we can make to the salary and benefit category in the mayor and council budget. As you know, under the measure passed by the Santa Barbara voters a couple years ago, the mayor and council salaries are tied to the area median income. And when the budget was filed in April, we did not yet have the area median income numbers for what would be the fiscal year 09 mayor and council salaries. And for the first time since the adoption of the measure by the voters, the actual, as you know by now, well, the area median income declined 2%. And so we had actually projected, I think, a 1 or 2% increase. And so now with that number in hand, we're able to reduce the budget by that $19,093. So we're proposing that recommended change. The second one on the schedule is a $43,500 recommended increase to the general fund budget for a transfer out for the RV overnight parking program. And as the agenda report mentions, in the current year, the council approved funding for an agreement with New Beginnings Counseling Center to manage the overnight parking program. The successful program is continuing, and staff recommends adding funding to the next year's budget to continue the program in fiscal year 09. And we would propose increasing this appropriation by the $43,500 as a transfer to the downtown parking fund where the program is managed.
Question.
So that means, Mr. Pearson, that when New Beginnings comes to us in the next couple of weeks, actually, and asks for funding, we've already appropriated that funding for next year's.
For the continuation of the
Within the
existing
budget.
program, that's correct.
So it's not going to be new money, it's going to be existing money.
Once we address
Well,
this.
once we
yes,
do this,
that's
then,
correct.
okay.
That is
Thank you.
correct. Any questions on that one? Other questions? Then the third one is I should say that the recommended funding source for that $43,500 is the appropriated reserve, which is in the recommended budget. And I guess I'll stop and take just a side note to mention and remind you that the recommended budget does include an appropriated reserve of substantially more money than would normally be the case. Normally, the appropriated reserve is roughly the equivalent of 0.5%, according to our policy of the recommended budget. But in this case, as you know, the appropriated reserve in the recommended budget is some $730,000. And staff included that in the recommended budget in recognition of the fact of two things, I think. Number one, and first and foremost, the likelihood, I guess, I was searching for the right word, certainly the possibility and possibly the likelihood that the resolution of the state budget situation will result in some reduction of revenue or increase in costs to the city as the state looks to balance its budget and to close that historic deficit that they are facing. And the other probably secondary reason for including it was because of the remaining uncertainty of the economic environment in terms of what our revenues are going to do. We believe, as you know, we believe we've been fairly conservative in our revenue estimates for next year, but that's not to say that we couldn't still see some shortfalls in our revenue estimates for next year. So those are really the two reasons, and it does have $730,000 or roughly in that appropriated reserve.
Before you go on, though, but essentially that is already eliminated by the reduction in the police funding that we got from the state.
Well, yes, and of course nothing's been settled yet.
Well, I understand that,
yes.
But if that reduction holds, then that more than covers the amount that we have in our reserve.
That's absolutely right.
Yes, okay.
That's absolutely right. And Mr. Chair, you're correct in pointing out that so far, at least, it seems that most of the hits that have been proposed, and most of the notable ones really have been proposed primarily by the Legislative Analyst's Office and rather than by the governor's budget or what the legislature has done, which of course really they haven't started to seriously consider the budget yet. As you know, that really doesn't take place until after the May revise, and that's only been a couple weeks. So.
And if I may add, Mr. Chair, I'm under the impression that there is going to be a last-minute raid on cities. We're just not sure exactly where that's going to be. But I'm going to SQA next week, and we'll find out.
So, the third general fund and final general fund adjustment is a reduction of that appropriated reserve I just mentioned by $24,407 to rebalance the general fund budget. So, moving along then to the downtown parking fund, there are two recommended adjustments. One is the flip side of the general fund adjustment I just described, which is an increase in the parking fund appropriation authority by $43,500 to cover the funding for the RV overnight parking program that I just described. The general fund had to increase appropriations to fund the transfer out. And the parking fund needs to increase appropriation authority in order to have the authority to spend those funds on the program. So that's the other side of it. That is covered by an increase in the revenue, which is the transfer in from the general fund. The second and final downtown parking fund adjustment is a reduction in a capital program of $440,000 for the revenue control equipment project. The staff had initially proposed the addition of $850,000 to an existing multi-year capital project to replace the revenue control equipment in the downtown parking lots and garages. Staff now recommends breaking the project into phases, with $410,000 needed to complete the work plan for next fiscal year, not $850,000 that was originally included in the recommended budget. So this is a reduction of $440,000 for fiscal year 2009.
You know, that one I have some questions about. Can we?
Sure. And then I was just going to, the last thought was that the remaining funding for the project would be included in the next 2-year financial plan for fiscal years 10 and 11.
It was my recollection that this replacement needed to be done and that we needed to get on with it. So I'm not quite sure what the benefit of delaying would be. And does it then jeopardize revenue collection.
Mr. Chair, I'll ask Paul Casey to respond to that, since he appears to be able and ready to.
Well, ready to. I don't know. Able. Is this doesn't. It is on. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Finance Committee. Chair Horton, we're not delaying the implementation of the revenue control equipment. Originally, as the capital project was budgeted, it included a number of components, the revenue control equipment, but also restriping of parking lots, some physical changes to some kiosks, and some other items. And it's those latter items that we're going to postpone just a year or two, and the main focus of the capital program will be the actual revenue control equipment that will roll out in a systematic manner and get that in place.
There was a lengthy discussion in downtown parking, I believe, on parking rates and the capital needs for that program. And this has been an ongoing all the way back to when I was a member of that committee. And so it was my recollection that we did have a progressive capital plan. And so I wasn't quite sure what the motivation was in doing this. I'm still not sure I understand.
And I think the main point is we probably lumped too many projects under one capital project heading and funded it that way. And so what we've done is we've broken it out into its incremental parts, which I think leads to a more appropriate rollout of the project and also helps with the long-term capital funding program to spend the money on the most needed items first and then roll out the other parts in the future years.
I could understand that. If that's the case, then I would suggest that you do you ask for a revision of the plan so that everybody can understand it and the committee can understand it, because I didn't get it, and so maybe others won't.
And we've been working with the committee on this. They're well aware of it, and we'll be updating the 6-year capital improvement program, which will lay this out very clearly as part of next year as well.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, I would like to back up Mr. Horton's suggestion in that there is now this new committee also that is involved in taking care of capital projects throughout the entire city. And so there are a lot of construction and capital projects that are going to be talked about that I think need to, for clarification purposes, be broken out and specifically delineated. And so if that's what you're doing, I think that's great. But let's get, real detailed about it so everybody understands it. Thanks.
Okay. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, that item concluded the recommended adjustments in the downtown parking fund. The next fund with a recommended adjustment is the water fund, and this is an increase in the water fund recommended budget of a fairly significant amount, $1.5 million even, and it is an increase recommended for chemicals for use at the Cater treatment plant. And as you know, there was you've heard from staff as recently as May 7th in a work session that we've seen a substantial increase in the requirements for chemical treatment at Cater as a result of the impacts of the runoff caused by the aftermath of the Zaka fire. I'm not an expert in these things, but it's like an activated carbon that is used to filter out debris from the water that has run into the watershed. And so this recommended adjustment would cover the anticipated additional costs of that activated carbon for next fiscal year, and it is $1.5 million, and it is recommended to come from the water fund reserves. Now, I need to add that we are still hopeful, at least, that some of these costs, if not a large portion of them, will be reimbursed to the water fund by the state OES. I know that water fund staff is working with OES on this because it was, of course, a declared state disaster. And under a declared state disaster, eligible costs can be reimbursed for at 75%, and then the local share is 25%. And while we don't have any definitive determination yet from state OES, I can say that we haven't heard no yet, which is probably as good as we can hope for at this point. And Rebecca Bjork and Kathy Taylor from Public Works are working closely with state OES, trying to coordinate the filing of. We've already filed what are called DSRs, or disaster survey reports, which is the mechanism that is used to submit an eligible cost for approval for reimbursement. Now, generally, those kinds of administrative reviews at the state level can take some time, but as I said, they are working, and we had been encouraged by state OES to submit these on DSRs. Whether that will ultimately result in partial or full reimbursement at the 75% rate, of course, remains to be seen. But whether or not that happens, this is not really an optional additional expense. In order to maintain the water quality of the city's potable water, this really does need to be done. The next to last one is for Measure D, which, as you know, is the Transportation Sales Tax Fund, and staff is recommending an additional appropriation of $200,000 to come from the accumulated Measure D reserves. This is to fund estimated consumer price index increases, annual CPI increases associated with the contracts with MTD for the electric and commuter shuttles and the enhanced transit programs. Additionally, the costs associated with our support of bus lines 6 and 11 were not included in the recommended budget because the implementation of those lines was dependent upon MTD gaining support from other agencies. That support has now been secured, and therefore staff is recommending the $200,000 adjustment to cover these costs for next fiscal year. And then lastly is the city's internal service fund for the information systems, the Information Systems Fund, and this is a recommended increase in appropriations of $85,000 to come from reserves in that fund. As you know, the revenue from that fund comes from payments made by other city funds for their information services systems and support. What is needed is the City Hall computer room in the basement needs an upgraded HVAC, or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, power replacement and fire detection and suppression system installed. The computer room really is not being kept at the optimal temperature that equipment needs to keep it running properly. And as you know, those kinds of installations generate a lot of heat. And in order to protect the city's investment as well as the functioning of our information systems backbone, this room really needs to be overhauled with updated HVAC system and, as it says, power replacement as well, and fire detection and suppression. Appropriations $85,000. The majority of this $85,000 would come from a Microsoft settlement check that we are going to be receiving in the current fiscal year. That's why it actually shows on the schedule as being funded from reserves, because the revenue that we receive in the Microsoft settlement this year would fall on June 30 to reserves, and then we would reappropriate it for next year. And then the balance of the money, the $35,000, would come directly from accumulated reserves in the Information Systems Fund.
Bob, on that one, I was again a little bit perplexed. To me, this is as basic a part of systems planning, a capital project, as there could be. I mean, you can't plan a project like this without planning for the cooling, for that matter, or the fire suppression. So why would this be? Why wasn't this included in the original project?
Well, I think that this really is the project. In other words, I don't think staff was. I think that the need for the replacement HVAC system really kind of, I want to say, snuck up on us, but it became apparent that we needed to accelerate this project because we'd had a couple incidents lately where the existing HVAC system just was not keeping up with the demand on it, and the computer room was definitely running hotter than is appropriate. I think it was something that probably had been planned for the next year or two, but given the degradation in the system that that we're proposing to move this project up.
Yeah, no, I understand all that, but we did already look at the remodel as a project. That's already
basement remodel.
Yeah, that's been presented. So it just seemed that this would be a normal part of that because you can't run a system without having the cooling. And so, in other words, if we hadn't received the Microsoft $50,000, what would we be doing at this point?
We'd be taking all 85,000 from accumulated reserves.
But shouldn't that have been in the original project? I guess it's
Well,
so many.
and all I can say on that is that the basement remodel project, I don't think it didn't really look at the computer room. I don't think that was envisioned as part of the basement remodel project because there really was no additional remodeling that was part of that project that was related to the computer room. And I can't answer your question is really what I'm saying.
Okay.
I don't know why that wasn't included.
I guess I'd be interested in learning about that.
Yeah, I just don't think it was envisioned as being part of the basement remodel. At the time, it just wasn't thought of as part of that project. It was and I think staff felt that believed that the system, while in need of upgrade and replacement, would have lasted another couple years, but it just hasn't worked out that way.
Yeah,
Jim?
that's pretty much what happened. When we looked at the basement remodel, we had the printing operation and the mailing operation had moved out, and we were reallocating space, and we really didn't look at the computer room. I think the IS staff started to become concerned about this when they had some failures, and really I became aware of it when they took me down there and about 3 months ago, and it was very, very warm. And then the other thing is we started talking about once we do the new server for the financial management system, we're going to add to the heat down there, and we decided it was better to move forward with this quickly. The Microsoft settlement is not what drove it. It just happened to be that when we said, where can we fund this, and we would have probably come to you if it wasn't for that Microsoft, either out of using fund reserves in IS or general fund reserves. But we really became aware of it, I think, in probably the last 6 to 9 months, and I became aware of it acutely when we went down there. We really looked at it. And then when we said, if we're going to do the air conditioning, we might as well do the uninterruptible power supply. We have a system like that now, but we need to upgrade it. And then we might as well put a good fire suppression service in there and make sure that room is pretty much up to industry standards.
So to try to conclude this, when we bring the new financial system online, this will be all covered. We won't be needing more AC for that, right? Okay, good enough. Okay, Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes the staff recommended adjustments, and we'd be glad to answer any questions on those. And I know we've sort of been answering them as we go along, but to the extent that the committee is comfortable doing so, staff would recommend that you consider these and make a recommendation on them.
Committee? Ms. Sarconi?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm very happy to go forward with the recommendations that you have here, but I was terribly ill last week, so I apologize for missing last week's session where I know we had an item that I asked to come to the committee and also to council that had to do with, well, if the county is being asked to cut $8 million out of mental health, how is that going to affect us, and in particular, our police and fire public safety units? Now, I haven't had a chance to review that tape, although I will before we adopt this final budget. And so I'm going to reserve any questions that I have until after I review that tape for that particular matter. However, that being said, we still are going to experience a tremendous cut in the police department, and that cut is somewhere in the neighborhood of $700,000, even when you add in the additional that we are going to be having as a boost in that department, and when you take away the various different non-cut or yearly sort of adjustments, the zig and the zag, if you will, of normal budgets. The police department budget is enormous, as it well should be, and so there's a tremendous zig and zag, if you will. And so, given the fact that there is a big adjustment that still is going to happen, I don't want to quibble about the actual dollars that it is. We are still going to reduce training. We're still going to hold a police captain position vacant for 6 months. We're still going to reduce overtime and hourly salaries. And we talked at one point at this committee level about finding some additional funds. And those funds were from the risk reserve funds. And there is a considerable portion, $800 out of the $1.25 million that's going to go back to the general fund. But we were talking about maybe reallocating some more of that back to the general fund, in particular to help out this department or maybe another department as well. So I may have missed that discussion at the former committee level conversation, and if I did, I apologize. If you could either reiterate or maybe we just have that conversation now.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Falcone, I don't think you did miss a discussion.
I don't think I did, but I
About
was
the
willing
risk,
to give you
but-
the benefit of the doubt.
Well, no, because we're prepared to have that discussion
Good.
today.
Great.
And
I think the idea today was two parts. First, have council review the recommended changes and then take an action on that, and then have the second part of the discussion, and then we were going to go into that workers' comp issue. So I think
In the meantime, I'm happy to move the staff recommendation adjustments, and
Well,
then
I'm
we can
going to
continue.
second Ms. Schneider's staff recommendation movement, the motion to move staff recommendation as they exist in the CAR.
Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
thank you, Mr. Chair.
So my question was timely.
well, now it's part two.
Thank you.
And
Before you start with the risk fund, can we go over one more time the actual number of the $767,000? Because more than half of that, as I look at the list, is actually additional revenues or holding off on buying vehicles for a year. So it's not a cut of $767,000. That's just the total number of adjustments to the budget, of which more than half of it includes added revenues to the department. So
And
can
I
that
actually
be
have a
clear
number
first?
of about $250,000.
Okay,
So
because I just want to make sure we all have the numbers clear, because what I heard you say, Ms. Falcone, was that the department's being cut by the tune of $767,000.
it is actually a reduction in the budget of $767,000. However, the actual reduction in possible service to the public amounts to about $250,000, which I was going to go into, but
Anyway, if that could be clarified, because I know that's been going back and forth. Thank you.
Mr. Pearson, you want to help us with that?
I'll try. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, what we have up on the screen, the overhead now, is the list of recommended adjustments to the police department budget. And I would have to say that, and I may have mentioned this to one or more of you individually, that probably staff did not do as good a job as we might have done in terms of categorizing the adjustments, not just for the police department, but for all of the departments, which is that the list you see there is one column, and it does indeed total some $767 or whatever $1,000, but it is a combination of revenue increases and expenditure reductions from the proposed budget. And I think that when you back out the revenue adjustments, the number is not really 767,000, and I don't, unfortunately. I'm sorry. $196,000 in Mr. Samario tells me in revenue adjustments, increases in revenue, and so. That brings the number down, and then there are some one-time adjustments. Councilmember Schneider mentioned the 6-month delay effectively in replacing the squad cars, and other one-time adjustments. And really, I think when you get down to the sort of ongoing costs, it's more in the $150,000 to $200,000 range. Again, I would mention that without and it's going to sound judgmental, but I don't mean it to be. But the fact is that the budget is still up $500,000 over the existing year adopted budget. The reduction is from an increase that was proposed for '09, which we're proposing to reduce that increase. That's not to say that, again, I'm not trying to value judge the individual adjustments that have been recommended, other than to say that it's what the police department came up with when they were asked to, and they were given a target number of that 700 and some odd thousand.
Just a point of clarification. We can get into the discussion next, but I did find this, the way it was presented, a bit confusing, and the people I've talked to that have been looking at this just from the TV screen have found it confusing. So perhaps when we do this next year, we can straighten it out a little
Right.
bit.
I would say that, and I'm not optimistic about this, but I would hope that next year we're not in the same spot. And but as you know from having looked at the multi-year forecast, and I think this is probably one of the staff's biggest concerns, not just for the police department but the entire general fund, is when we looked at the multi-year forecast, you remember that a large portion of the adjustments that are recommended for this fiscal year, out of $4.1 million of adjustments, essentially almost $2 million, $1,959,000 are one-time in nature. And you remember, I know that from looking at the multi-year forecast, that we still have probably, based on our forecast and our projections, about a $2 million problem that we would be forced to solve for next fiscal year, 2010, and that does not include any impacts from ongoing state budget adjustments. Keep in mind that the 700 and some odd thousand, $30,000 in the appropriated reserve is essentially one-time money. Sure. But I mean that's the background. I don't. I mean, we could go through the list one by one if the committee desires, but I think that at least were I to do this over again, I would at a minimum separate out two columns for all departments: revenue increases and expenditure adjustments.
Ms. Falcone?
That'd be great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to kind of cut to the chase, as I said, I don't want to quibble over the actual, what's in, what's out, blah, blah, things have gone up, things have gone down, all that stuff. Well, I have three areas here that I'm particularly concerned about, and I would like to have a discussion here at the committee level about that. And some of them are ongoing. One of them in particular is or two of them are not. One of them is, or one's a one-time and two are ongoing. The first one has to do with the reduction of overtime and hourly raises, and that's a $53,000 item. It doesn't sound like a lot, but we all actually up here have experienced the pain and suffering that happens when we pass a tipping point in particular departments, in particular the police department. And I don't think the public at large is willing to do that again. So I'm concerned about that item, although it doesn't look like it's that much. The second item is also one that doesn't look like that much, but it's a reduction in training, and that's a $37,000 item. And although we may not think of training as something that we can live without because all the people we have are so well trained, but as an attorney, and I'm sure as accountants and various other folks, you have ongoing professional training opportunities that you really have to meet according to state law, and this has to do with a lot of that meeting requirements. Now, $37,000 doesn't sound like a lot in the scheme of things, but it actually does mean that certain people will not be able to take the opportunity to avail themselves of that benefit. The third one is the one that is most concerning to me, actually, and that is to keep a police captain position open for 6 months. Now, in a big department like Los Angeles and various other places, that may not mean a whole lot, but we only have 3 captains. The police department of 140 people, as we have, desired it to be staffed at, and anticipate and expect it to be staffed at in the future, at least, are divided into three different categories. One is patrol, one is sort of administration, and the other one, investigation. So these are and they rotate around. But if you only have three captains, and you take one away, and we're going to be suffering the loss of a number of high-level department heads in the police department in the next year or so. I know of one deputy chief, and I know of two captains that are possibilities. Now, I don't want to take the thunder out of their sails, but it's a fact. Now, if we're going to hold a police captain position vacant for 6 months, what does that exactly mean to the ongoing operations? We have lieutenants that are absolutely stellar, and I really hope, I've got some high hopes for the next oral exams that are coming up. However, that being said, I do not think that just at this point in time, when we have got the police department back online, we still don't have our arms totally around the gang problem. We still don't have our arms totally around the vagrancy problem, the homeless problem, various different issues that are happening, the narcotics problem. It's not a time to start cutting positions, even for a limited amount of time. I feel passionate about this. Mr. Armstrong, I understand exactly. Mr. Pearson, I understand exactly. And Chief, wherever you are, I understand. You're good soldiers. You'll make it work. It doesn't make it right. I'm here to say I don't think it's right, and I think that we have monies that are available that we can appropriate to cover these various small $230,000 in a $230 million budget. I think we can do this. I'd like to have a discussion about it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Ms. Snyder.
Thank you. Well, when we had the police department budget hearing with the full council, I also mentioned the police captain position open for 6 months, and that concerned me out of everything in the budget. So I think it sends the wrong message to keep a position open even for 6 months, even though it's not a patrol position, because there is a domino effect how that all works if you keep a position open. So I completely agree that that should be something that we should put back into the budget. I also think the overtime and hourly salaries, based on our experience with the bike patrols, that we went beyond what we thought we budgeted for this year, and we actually had to appropriate more money in order to keep the bike patrols. So then to take money out of overtime and hourly salary sort of defeats that purpose. So we should put that part in. I guess I have the issue about the training. I have a question. It's reducing training. It's not eliminating training. And so that, I guess, depending on what it is that we're reducing in terms of training, if that actually stops someone from moving into another level of police work or something like that because that's not available to them, I'm not sure I have the answer to that. So that I would have to, I would like to ask for clarification prior to when maybe we adopt the budget. So I'm not ready to go forward there, but certainly the police captain position open for 6 months and the overtime and hourly salaries I think we should put back in. How we fund it, I would suggest we have $730,000 of appropriated reserves that I know we want to keep in case what the state does and what happens with county mental health, if that affects us and all those kind of things. We don't know the answers to that yet. But if we take the más o menos $128,000 and the $53,000 from this budget and take it away from that $730,000, that still leaves $549,000 rounding off that we could hold on to. And then in response to the risk pool, if there are other monies coming in or how we can have that policy discussion, we can have that policy discussion now and move it forward. But I would suggest the first place to look is here. And then if there are other adjustments to the risk pool that happens, we can always backfill this number with that amount from the risk pool if we want to do that. But this is where, to me, the cleanest way of using funds to fund those important things should come from. And we'll get, I guess that will lead into the discussion of the risk pool and what that means in terms of taking money that was going back to other enterprise funds, rebates to other enterprise funds. Because to me, if you look at, I'll just start that discussion by saying, if we reduce, for example, the waterfront rebate, that reduces funding that would go to the Harbor Patrol. If we reduce the airport refund, rebate, that can reduce the airport patrol. So, I mean, there's still public safety aspects that would go back to some of those rebates in some of those enterprise funds, and then the others being water, wastewater. Those are infrastructure things that we know we're taking money out for, major funding to increase our water supply after the Zaka fire. We don't know if we're going to get reimbursed for there. So that I'll start that discussion. But I agree totally with the police captain position and the overtime and hourly salaries for the
Before we
department.
actually start that one, I wanted to talk a little bit more. I guess it's 7A. I'm not exactly sure, but in attending the downtown organization meetings, there's a continued concern about presence on State Street, and particularly during the holiday season that's coming up. And I know that the downtown organization board just had a retreat, and this was their primary focus was that area. So again, if money to support additional presence in the downtown over the summer months would come from 7A, then that clearly would not be an area that I'd want to see reduced, just to throw another factor in there. In any event, shall we discuss then the way of funding some of these issues, Bob? Do you want to lead us through that discussion?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Two funding sources really have been mentioned. One is the revisiting the allocation of the staff recommended risk management rebates, and the other is the appropriated reserve that's contained in the recommended budget. And just bear with me if you would, just so people don't get the wrong impression on the risk management rebates. I want to reemphasize that the rebates that we have proposed from the Risk Management Fund represent accumulated reserves in the Risk Management Fund that exceed the actuarially recommended reserve levels in that fund. So this is not a raid of existing reserves that are needed to meet obligations. These are reserves that have accumulated in the Risk Management Fund that exceed the actuarially determined reserve requirements. And the reason that these funds have been accumulated is because of our very, very excellent experience over the last couple years with our workers' compensation program, because of our return to work program, a modified duty program, and because of an excellent safety program and the excellent work of the departments, we've managed to bring our self-insured workers' comp costs in substantially below both previous experience and below what the actuaries had actually projected we would need to fund the program. So that by way of background, because I don't want anyone to think, I know the committee doesn't, but anyone in the public to think that somehow we're taking reserves that really are rightfully belong to the Risk Management Fund and are needed there. We're rebating funds that were paid by the various operating funds and departments. So with that said, by way of background.
Mr. Chair, I dearly appreciate your explanation. Can I say it in just very simple terms?
Please do.
The fact that the various funds pay into the Risk Management Fund is because people sue us from all different kinds of places for all different kinds of things. The fact that we have a reserve in the Risk Management Fund means that either we haven't been sued as much as the state requires us to keep. The state requires us to keep a certain fund, depending on our liabilities and so forth. It's a big calculation. So either we haven't been sued that much, which is a good thing, and please don't start suing us, or we have been successful in putting off those claims in terms of we have either won the claims or they have been without merit or we have successfully settled for less. So let's just be really clear. This is a fund that comes from all the different departments that is a hedge fund, not a hedge fund, it's a buffer. It's a buffer to pay out litigation costs because the city gets sued all the time for all kinds of things. whether they're, noticed or not. I mean, whether or not people recognize it or not. There are 100 open cases in the city attorney's office at any given time. The fact that we have a buffer in that fund means that we are just not paying out as much in claims as the state, according to our budget and the calculations, think we should have in that. So it's appropriate to either give it back to the funds or to give it back to the general fund, as I think we might, to spread it out for a service that benefits the entire city. So is that accurate, or
Well,
I mean,
I
you
would-
may not agree with my conclusion, but
Mr. Pearson?
No, I would add one thing. I think in large measure that's accurate. I would think that the thing I would add to that, though, is that the risk management fund really covers two primary areas, and you've touched on one, which is the liability side. The other piece is the workers' compensation side. And in this case, I think that the surplus funds that we are proposing to rebate are coming from the workers' comp side of the shop. And we really do account for those programs separately. They're both in the risk management fund, which you're absolutely right, acts essentially as a city insurance company where all the departments and all the operations pay premiums into this fund for the coverage that we provide. But in this case, the $1,250,000 rebate that we're proposing is really coming from the workers' compensation side of the shop. You're absolutely right about the fact on the liability side, our experience has also been positive, less than the actuaries and the other experts have said we should expect. But in this case, the $1.25 million is from the workers' compensation side, and is really, you're absolutely right again, that it's a rebate of premiums that have been paid into this fund for the workers' compensation coverage that we provide to each and every one of the city's departments, funds, operations, programs.
I just wanted to
activities.
comment to Mr. Falcone that when I started on finance, our experience was considerably worse. And to me, what we're seeing is really the focus on the workers' comp issues and not having the accidents. And in other words, it's not so much that we're not getting lawsuits settled, but it's that we're not having the injuries, and we're not. People are either taking better care of themselves, or there's more concern about safety on the job. It's an improvement in work processes and standards, really, that's paying off for us now. I mean, that's the way that I have assumed it is.
And I think that's, Mr. Chair, I think that's right. I would add to it that a significant factor, and we don't need to, I mean, I don't want to turn this into any more than you care to, a discussion of the risk management operation, but I think the other piece I would add to that is the city's modified duty program, where we are able to bring people back to work in a modified duty capacity before they're ready to return to work full-time in their existing job. And by getting them back to work earlier, it helps them transition back into the workplace more quickly, and it saves us money. And we found that program to be extremely successful in reducing our workers' compensation costs. If I might just sort of as an overview, and I know, I apologize, did we have hard copies to hand out? This overhead is a little difficult to read on the screen.
I have a comment to that
please.
just before you start that.
Sure,
Would
Falcone,
you mind?
please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to finish the loop on that, I understand that the workers' comp piece is big, and I didn't mention it because you did, but if you're going to break that out and start rebating back, I would submit that what you have both just said actually bolsters the argument for why some of this money should go back to the police department, because a lot of the workers' comp has come from savings in the police department, actually, because once we, and a lot of it has been sort of attributed to phasers, whether or not that's true or not. It happens to be a coincidental kind of a situation, maybe, or maybe it's just true that a lot of the workers' comp money, I think it was $600,000 in the last police report, that has been saved in the police department, has come from the lack of 400, well, I thought it was 600, but all right, if you say it's 400, has come from the police department. And so actually the monies that I'm talking about in these three various areas really only come to about 230. So I would submit that if you feel it's necessary to go ahead and rebate it back in proportion, that an overweighting actually go into the police department. Maybe that's where we backfill. I'm not all that keen on using reserves, but I will if that's the only way we can get to 4, and that's fine. But I really do think there's a substantial argument to be made here that if it is workers' comp, well, they've saved more than any other department.
Actually, I think the number you're probably referring to is if you look at the fire and police combined, it's about the 600,000. And it is going back to them, right? According to this proposal.
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, what we did was we basically took and prorated the rebate. There were two pieces to this, as you can see from the schedule. The first piece is $250,000, which we took as an ongoing rate reduction. Right. So that was an ongoing rate reduction, meaning that because we believed that the reduction in our workers' comp costs allowed us to actually reduce our premium charges to funds and departments. So we took $250,000 and we just flat out reduced the rates. So that's an ongoing adjustment. The next to last column is the rebate portion, which is $1,250,000. And again, staff's methodology, I'm not, trying to defend it. I'm just trying to explain it, was to take it and to rebate the dollars based on percentage of premiums paid.
And if I can just finish that thought then, it's not so much dollar for dollar. It's about really doing kind of what's right. And I think that there are certain services to the community that if we're going to backfill in a certain kind of way, then, and we have the money here, I think that the services that are provided to various different departments can more than compensate for the amount I'm talking about. So at any rate, I'm going to end that discussion.
Okay. Ms. Schneider, any further comments on
Well, just as I understand, and correct me if I'm not getting this right, these numbers here are because everyone in the city, no matter what department they're in, whether it's enterprise fund, general fund, public safety, not public safety, the whole city entity has reduced their workers' comp experience, meaning they're staying healthier, they're coming back to work earlier, they are saving the city money by reducing the number of injuries and illnesses citywide, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And so the rebate here is already proportional to what each department and each enterprise fund has put into this fund to begin with. So they're just getting back what they originally put in.
A portion of it.
Okay. So if we were to move, for example, some of the waterfront rebate over to the general fund, that would mean money, that would mean that the waterfront enterprise budget would not see that increase in revenue of that amount of, where is it? It would be 89,027. So where would then the waterfront department get that funding? How would they then balance their budget?
Mr. Armstrong?
Maybe first in terms of the big picture, because we've had some discussions both with the finance and also with the city attorney's office about where would it be appropriate and where would you not create legal problems if you wanted to move workers' comp premiums around. And I think we believe that if you look at the enterprise operations, especially starting with the airport, because of FAA restrictions on the use of airport funds and because they receive a lot of grant funds, that would be very problematic. Mm-hmm. We believe also at the waterfront, because of state tidelands trust issues, that would be problematic. We also believe in water and in wastewater, it would be problematic because of bond covenants that we have and how we use the rates. And I think we would strongly recommend that if you want to move workers' comp monies out, that you don't move workers' comp monies out of those places. Because those are just, you're going to get yourself in trouble and it's a slippery slope. If you did want to take workers' comp money monies out, probably the only places that we think there would be no legal impediments would be downtown parking, because in many cities that is in the general fund, and it could be in our general fund. It's just a policy not to have it there, and the golf fund. Both of those are relatively small operations. On ICS, you might be able to do it there. However, ICS is using these savings to reduce the rates they're charging to the departments, so they're already reducing rates there.
Right.
And I think those are the big ones in there. There's some other little minor ones, but we think that generally, I think we believe you need to have some integrity in the system. And the other thing that to remember is that one of the incentives that we as management give to the departments when they have improved safety is that their premiums go down.
That's right.
And if then we say, okay, you did a great job and you improved your safety record, and so we're going to take that savings and give it to another fund, it creates management problems, and I'm not sure it's worth that, especially because it's a relatively small amount of money, especially out of golf and downtown park.
So let me ask, okay, so if the ones that you said could be legally problematic, let's take those off the table. Let's say the downtown parking, the $44,000 there. How would downtown parking budget get balanced if this was taken out and brought over to the general fund instead?
Probably the quick answer is first year out of fund balance, and eventually it would flow into rates, probably 3-4 years down the road.
I still have a problem with this idea. I think because this budget has a $730,000, it's not the reserves that we're talking about here is not the reserves that have been accumulating over time. This is a separate, particular pot of money that was put into this budget to cover other items that may come from the state, it may come from county changes, it may come from who knows where, and that's where I think it's the cleanest way, because it's within the general fund monies, to reallocate back into the police department for the things we talked about before. To me, taking money from some of these other departments and rating it and putting it into the general fund reminds me similarly of what the state might be doing to us, because we're doing a good job in keeping some money and saying, you're doing a good job, you're lowering your costs, you're able to make some money, we're going to take it. And I don't think that sends the right message to some of our city employees who are doing a good job, where it's not like if everyone is taking care of themselves, we're reducing illnesses and injuries on the workplace, but only one part of the city budget should benefit from it. Everyone should benefit from it proportionately. And I agree that the vast majority, more than half of actually $700,000 of the 1.5, half of that is going directly to police and to fire. So that makes perfect sense to me. And then a lot of it in the going back to what I was saying earlier, if you go back to waterfront and the airport, that money helps then fund our airport patrol and our harbor patrol. So that's also part of public safety, which is important. So I philosophically have a problem with this, because if these funds did not put the money in there to begin with, there wouldn't be the money to put back. And so it came directly from these departments originally. It wasn't like the general fund granted the enterprise funds this money to offset their risk management pool. This was something that each individual department put into their own risk management pool, and they put too much in, so they're going to get their money back. So I'll stop.
Another way of looking at that, I guess, is that the general fund total is almost $1 million. And it's possible to, if you wanted to disproportionately allocate back, you could simply look at the $961,000 and allocate that disproportionately without getting into the enterprise fund, because there are some, I know in my previous work at the university, we were always, and for the reasons that you outlined, very careful about keeping it, we call those auxiliary enterprises, but keeping those funds separate, because you get into all kinds of barrels of snakes when you start mixing general funds and enterprise funds. It is a slippery slope. I agree with that. But not to say that there isn't almost $970,000 here in the general fund. However, it is true that well over half of this entire thing is going back to PD and fire anyway. So
Just one comment. If the council wants to restore funding in the police department, our recommendation is you take it out of those appropriated reserves, and then when the state gets done with its issue, we come back to you with options if we end up using it. But I think if you try and do it out of here, again, it's a slippery slope, and I think you're not going to get that much money if it's just out of downtown parking and golf. And
Mr. Chair?
why go through
Yes.
that?
I'd like to make a
that
motion
issue.
then, Don, on that
Well,
note.
okay, I just wanted to make another comment before we do that. The general rule for public funding that I'm at least familiar with is that we try not to overmanage and micromanage the details. And I think we'd be better off to stay at the macroeconomic level and make our I think we all agree with what's been said here today in terms of where we don't want to see the cuts made, but I'm not sure it leads us to a lot of fruit to try to analyze where specifically we would allocate the funds from, because we don't know the result. But further on that point, my main concern today is that we haven't gone deeply enough in terms of our reserve funds. And my preference in terms of being secure would be that we go even further and hold money in reserve, because we don't know what's going to happen. And I would hate to see us approve a budget when, at this point in time, with what we know, which is admittedly is imperfect and may not happen, we're already essentially through our reserves. And so I would prefer that we make a point of the areas that we think we would like to have restored, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But that we consider holding additional money in reserve until we know what's going to happen. I don't want to see us approve a budget that's going to mean that we have virtually no flexibility depending on what happens to us. And I think Ms. Falcone just said there may be an additional raid coming up here. So I'm really nervous about proceeding with something where we're just right on the line.
Mr. Chair, if I could just make a comment before a motion. I really appreciate the committee's comments with respect to recognizing the severity of the few items that I've called to the attention of the committee as being important, and I gratefully will take funding from, I suppose, whatever source is available. However, I am loath to do it from reserves because I am pretty sure there's going to be some fiscal pain coming from the state, and I'm not quite sure exactly, and I'm not at the moment at liberty to discuss it, but there is going to be some problems, and to go more deeply into reserves, I'm trying my level best to accomplish both goals at the same time, and keeping the city fiscally solvent with respect to the reserves and the oh my God, what's going to happen scenario, and keeping the city safe and having all the police department funding complete is they're both of equal importance, and so I'm trying to be creative. I'm trying if what Mr. Horton says can be done, then we could actually take from this particular fund where the reserves are being rebated, hold off on rebating to the other departments. And I understand the enterprise zones, and I agree with you on the enterprise zones. There's legal slippery slopes that I don't want to get into. But as Mr. Horton just pointed out, there's almost $1 million. We're talking about 230 or so. So if there's going to be a hold off on paying back to certain departments, I would just assume that we keep the department, the police department, whole in these terms with some of the monies that we have not from reserves, and hold off on paying back the departments that have legitimately paid into the fund. If that's not feasible, I would look for some other opportunity, some creative opportunity aside from reserves to try to accomplish the goals. So Mr. Pearson, Mr. Samario, Mr. Armstrong, You are the legal and, well, you're the financial wizards of the city and also legal wizards. And so here's my dilemma, and I would ask for your assistance in trying to accomplish both without getting us into any trouble.
I guess here's the challenge. If you don't want to take it out of reserves, you mean if you take it out of workers' comp, you're taking it out of workers' comp reserves. If you take it out of the appropriated reserve, you're taking it out of general fund reserves. Both places, it's one-time money. It's not ongoing. So to me, actually, your bigger problem is not fiscal year 2009. It's fiscal
10,
year 2010. But both of the places, if you say, we could easily kick up the rebate from workers' comp a little higher and even spread it proportionally, and we could come up with 250 grand to restore in police and not take it out of general fund reserves. And if, in fact, the state came to us in September and said, guess what, we're going to hit you for $1 million, that would be probably one of the options we would give to you anyway. But I think it's really important to put this in the context of right now we're balancing this budget with about $2 million of one-time revenues and expense cuts. So we're going to be having this discussion probably next fall, and unless the economy kicks up to 5% and 6% revenue growth instead of the 3% and 4% we're expecting. And so this is, I wouldn't get too caught up in the $250,000 problem. But I think it's important more to put it in the context of we still have a $2 million issue we're going to have to deal with.
The thing that strikes me about the whole circumstance right now is that the state of California has been operating with structural deficits for quite a while, and it looks like we're going to be even worse in the future and right now. The governor's proposals, at least the first ones that I saw, such as drawing on future lottery potential revenues, are to me very iffy at best, and so I just don't think we have enough information today at this meeting right now to decide what we want to do. Now, if indeed we have a structural deficit in the city, then the only way around that, from my standpoint, is to make a structural change to make sure that we don't have a deficit. And all the things that we're talking about today are, as Mr. Armstrong says, they're one-time changes. They are not structural changes to the base. So I think we'd be, as a committee, this is just where I'm coming from, we'd be better off to say these are the things that we don't want to see cut as we proceed in this budget process. But I don't believe that I'm ready to make a recommendation about precisely how to fund it at this point until we know if this is just part of our problem or if we're going to have a problem that may be several times this. Now, I don't know what sort of emotion you're looking for today, but at least that's where I'm coming from.
Let me start with a question first. Mr. Armstrong, you said that it's possible to increase the rebate proportionately across all boards. So the number that we have here up on the screen there was a number that's above policy reserves currently. If taking after this rebate, are we at policy reserves or are we still above policy reserves?
And I'll ask the Bobs to correct me if I'm wrong, but the last actuarial we did showed us having, and we don't have policy reserves in the risk management fund. What we do is we do an actuarial analysis.
What their recommendation
we have liabilities and we have assets.
Right.
And our assets, our cash assets, exceeded our liabilities by about $2.5 million.
Yes.
And so
we took 1.5 of the.
So we basically took half of the $1,250,000, the one time, and then we also felt, based on our experience, that we could reduce ongoing costs to the departments by $250,000 a year.
Okay.
So we didn't take it all because we felt that for many years we had a negative. We were down, I think, 3-4 years ago, $3-4 million in that fund, where our liabilities exceeded our assets, and so through good management, the state law, and everything, we've got ourselves in a good position, and we didn't want to take it all. But you could conceivably do that. But again, I think I want to caution you, it's one-time money.
Right.
It's not ongoing. But the other thing I'll say, and the Bobs can correct me, but we're also having a very good year in fiscal year 2008. So we think we're going to add to that surplus at the end of this year rather than take anything away.
And when would we know that information?
Mr. Chair, council members, we will know that preliminarily. We will know that by the middle of July, once the dust settles on this fiscal year. I would just say that if you look at the schedule that's up there, you can see that the general fund represents about 64% of the total. That's that column, the second column of numbers. In order to generate an additional $250,000 for the general fund, which represents 64 cents on the dollar, we would need to increase the overall rebate total by about $390,000. So if we increased rebate $390,000 and change, that would generate, based on a 64% of that going to the general fund, that would generate about $250,000 additional for the general fund.
Okay. I'm going to try a motion in two parts. The first motion, so we can be clear, is what this committee is recommending to council of what not to cut from the budget in the police department, and that would be to reinstate 7A, which is the overtime and hourly salaries, 7D, which is the training, and 8, which is the police captain
Put that
position.
slide back up.
And 8, which is the police captain position vacant for 6 months, to put that back into the budget. That's one motion.
Training,
7A.
captain, and overtime.
Correct.
Second.
Okay, that's a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, second motion. How to fund this amount is that because we do not have the new actuarial numbers for fiscal year 08, in order to balance the budget this month, to take it from appropriated reserves with the knowledge that in July or whenever we get the new actuarial amount, any amount above the recommended amount should go then into reimbursing that reserve. Does that make sense? Because we don't know the number now, we can't just take it. But when we do get it, we'll backfill the reserves up to the $250,000.
In which
whatever the
fund?
number is.
In which fund?
Well, it would be proportional all throughout.
Are you
So-
talking about the risk fund, or are you talking about the reserves?
I'm talking about in order to balance
The
the budget.
reserves of the risk fund?
In order to balance the budget this month, that we take it from the allocated reserves in the general fund to balance the budget with what we just proposed to put back in the budget in the police department. That's part one. Part two is in July, when we get the new actuarial amounts from the risk fund, that the amount that is above what the recommended actuarial amount is, we will backfill into the reserve. See what I'm saying? Because I don't want to put in a number. I don't want to increase the rebate of workers' comp today without knowing how much it is that we're able to do, and we don't have that data yet.
Point of clarification, however, but do we really need to do that extra step? I'm not sure we gain anything by doing the extra step. I mean, what do we gain by going one and then moving it back 6 weeks from now?
Well, I think that what you would gain from that would be that we would know what the results of operations are for the risk management fund for fiscal year 08. And as Mr. Armstrong mentioned, here we are basically at the end of May, 11 months through the fiscal year. And workers' comp costs, for example, don't come in pro rata through the year. And so we don't know what the month of June will bring in terms of payments. But we would say that as of this point in time, it certainly appears to us, with 11 months virtually in the books, that once again, our workers' comp expenses in the risk management fund are coming in substantially below what we have budgeted this year for that. So if that trend holds for one more month, then we will know that at the end of the fiscal year that we would be adding to the risk management reserves that are already in excess of actuarial
Yes.
requirements. So that's what we would
But
know.
we're 11/12 through it, essentially.
That is true.
So
But we don't. But anything can happen in June. That happens with healthcare costs too. If something happens the last month, your premium goes skyrocketing when you didn't expect it to. So I'm not quite sure we should increase the rebate the workers' comp rebate without numbers that we have.
No, I understand what you're saying, but I guess my question is, do we really need to worry about that? Can't we say that would another approach be, based on the trends so far, that our recommendation is that you use the workers' comp fund rather than going to the reserve fund? I mean, could we say that and not cause a problem?
I think based upon the fact that the workers' comp fund has $1,250,000 surplus already, and that we don't, I think it's very doubtful that something's going to happen in the next 30 days that would change the work. No, I think with workers' comp,
Right.
it just doesn't go that way.
Okay.
I think you could safely say increase the rebate to cover that. And I think you also need to know that come probably September, we'll be coming back to the council if the state does something to us in excess of that $700,000 you have in appropriated reserves and have to rebalance anyway. So we would be having that discussion about the broader picture.
Okay, then I'll rephrase my motion.
No,
No, I'll rephrase my motion that in order to pay for these items that we put back in the budget, we increase proportionately throughout the city the workers' comp rebate in order to cover the general fund piece of the previous motion. Does that make sense?
Do you understand that?
Yes.
And that is rather than going from the.
So it'd be increasing another $390,000 citywide in order to get the $250,000 into the general fund.
Understood.
Okay?
Okay. Is there a second to that?
You want to repeat it?
The money is coming from the workers' comp fund, not from the general fund.
Right.
The money is coming from, we are increasing the amount of the
I
rebate of the
understand- I
workers'
understand the
comp
numbers.
fund. Correct.
I understand the numbers. I just want to be very simple and very clear. All right, I'll second it.
Okay. I just think that we need to make it clear that this is based on the assumption that the numbers hold, and that there will be enough money there, and that you will come back to us anyway in the fall should there be an issue. Is that a correct assumption?
That's absolutely right. I mean, I'm not don't like sticking my neck out, but I think I can stick my neck out far enough to suggest that the workers' comp fund can afford at this point another $390,000 of
Okay.
rebate.
Well, that being said, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Didn't know whether that. If there was.
I just had a couple of other
ma'am.
comments, if I could.
Please.
First off, I want to commend everyone in all departments of coming up with ways to make adjustments by the amount of $4 million. And in terms of new revenues or really looking at their budgets very carefully, because I think that made our jobs a lot easier because you were not cutting positions and you were not cutting services. And that was tremendous. And in fact, I was thinking as we were going through this budget process that we may want to even, just because we have the money doesn't mean we always need to spend it. And in some ways, we might have, even if we didn't have the financial issues we did this fiscal year, we may have wanted to shave things a little bit and put money back into reserves if we had the opportunity to do so. So I think that kind of philosophy we may want to look into as we go into the next 2-year fiscal plan. So I appreciate that. This is my third year on Finance Committee, and it's the third year I'll ask again that we look at our reserve policy, especially the $1 million capital number amount. That's not a percentage. I'll just put that on the table. You know, I know it's coming. I'm just putting it on the table. And I do want to just mention 2 other items. I know it's come up in council about 2 other positions. One was a forestry position, and one was the rental housing mediation task force. The positions that are remaining open. I've talked to a number of other people since then, and what I'd like to see on the forestry position is in 6 months or so to see how that's going. I'm okay keeping it open for now, but the trees are still going to grow, and someone's still going to need to trim them. And if all that money goes to contractors, why are we paying contractors when we could pay our own staff person? I think the conversation we had here in this room at the last meeting sort of answered some of the questions, but not completely. But I'll trust staff for now to keep that as opposed to adding more money back into the general fund budget for that position. But I would like to see it in 6 months or so. And that would be my recommendation back to council because I know they asked about it. And then the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force, as I understand it, there were two positions, and one position was when the person left was held open or someone's moved into another position. And that funding comes from HUD, not from the general fund, and it's because the HUD, the Federal Housing Urban Development, is reducing their funding to the city. That's why we had to keep that position open. It's not a general fund cut. Again, with having only one staff person for that whole program, I'd like to see in 6 months how that's going. I'm concerned that there might become a backlog that might cost us more money down the road, and I know we have a great task force of volunteers, but want to know what the backup situation of that would be. So I don't think we need to make any adjustments to the budget for now, but I know those were two things that I know the rest of the council were concerned about, and those would be my suggestions on how to address those two positions.
On that latter point, I actually talked about this with the mayor yesterday, and I'd like to see a workload layout for the last 2 or 3 years on that to see what the trends are in terms of mediation cases, because I think it gets back to P3 planning and the kind of thing that we like to do. And if indeed the caseload is expanding and we're cutting, then that's one thing. If the caseload is flat or going down, then it's a whole other issue. And I'd like to see some actual data on that to assist me in making a decision. And a point that I just wanted to add is that I guess I'm feeling a little more pessimistic right now, and the reason is a few weeks back I thought that the revenues looked consistent and even on the plus side, but the last couple of reports seem like the revenues are actually down from what I was hoping for. I mean the revenues that we count on in the city. And the housing information in the state of California is a little strange right now, because it seems like there are some sales happening, prices are weak, and I'm not sure that we've actually reached the bottom. I mean, some people are saying we have, but I'm not sure that's the case. So my feeling right now as we look forward would be to be a little bit more careful, and to make sure that when you come back to us, that we take into consideration the fact that we may not actually be at the bottom of this thing yet. I know that's how you guys like to plan, and I appreciate that. And I just want to say that I'm not feeling particularly optimistic at this point in the fiscal year, and want to remain very cautious. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, if I could just back you up on that, I'm also feeling less than optimistic. And you know me, I always look for the silver lining in just about everything I try to do, but I'm not particularly sanguine here. And I do believe very, very strongly that we are going to take a hit from the state. The legislature is talking in quiet, hushed tones at the moment, but I think it's going to come full bore in the next, certainly, week. I don't think the revenues, as Mr. Horton said, are performing as well as we anticipated, and even as well as we have readjusted for. So I think there are going to be a multitude of problems. There's going to be not pain that we can't deal with. We're a very well-run city. We are a very wealthy city. We do have a lot of money. We just have to spend it in the correct ways. I think we do, but I think that the community is going to need to make some priorities over the next couple of years, and maybe only for the next couple of years, but we're going to have to really have some very strong conversations about where we have money and where we want to spend money. Where do the people want us to spend money? And I'd like to just bolster what Mr. Horton just said, and that is that here's another member of the Finance Committee who hasn't been here for, that long. It's my first year, but I've been around here for a while. So I'm just not feeling particularly happy, and I've been through the bad. Mr. Horton and I went through the bad times of 9/11 together, and the years that followed that, and those were the worst of all possible worst. I don't think it's going to be that bad, but it's not going to be pretty for the next year or two. So I think we have to go forward with that understanding. So thank you very much for
Okay.
the support on the police department.
Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob just slid me the remaining schedule, and I mentioned budget adoption on the 24th, which is, I was correct on that, but I obviously neglected to mention that there's a fairly important step in between today and budget adoption, which is on Tuesday, June 10th, in the evening session. Your committee's recommendations will come to the full council, and we as staff will be looking for direction from the full council for any remaining adjustments to the budget. We would be looking to the full council for final direction on the staff recommended adjustments that you voted unanimously to recommend to them, and then the changes to the police department budget that you are also will be recommending to them, and then any other issues that the remaining four members of council, the mayor and the members of council may choose to discuss. That will be on Tuesday, June 10th at the evening session, and then budget adoption 2 weeks after that. On
Could I don't know if I'm going to be around enough in the next few days for this to work, but I would kind of like to see the wording that you use in our recommendations back to the full council. And the reason I say that is this is a tricky topic today that we've tried to cover, and I know we've grappled with it here for the last hour and a half, and you're dealing with potential structural deficits, you're dealing with one-time money, you're dealing with money both in general fund and in enterprise funds, and you're dealing with rebates, either by fund or by part, and it's a complex, it's an equation with a number of variables. And for the benefit of our colleagues that haven't had a chance to sit through this meeting, I want to make sure that the wording is very clear. We've had enough trouble with it here, and we know more about it than our colleagues do because they haven't been in these meetings. So I'm really asking that we just go overboard to make sure that this is a clear a description of what we did today.
Mr. Chair, staff, we will try to get out for the committee's review a draft of your recommendations to you in the next day or so that you can then look at and give us feedback on
That'd
to
be
make
great.
sure they accurately reflect your understanding. I also we can also suggest to the remaining four that if it's of interest to them, they can go online and watch the meeting.
They certainly can.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the full context.
One comment. I think it might be helpful if the committee wants to recommend to the full council that at least the finance committee review the impacts of the tree trimming position being held vacant and the rental housing mediation specialist being held vacant, that we would return to the finance committee on approximately January the 1st with a report on the impact of those two issues.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So if you need that as a motion, I'll make that as a motion.
Is there a second to that? They would bring back.
Do you need a motion
Well,
for
you
that?
didn't. You mentioned
It would be a
and it wasn't-
recommendation, I guess, from the committee to council that those two other vacant
Well, I need
positions.
more information before I can vote on a motion on that. I mean, January 1st sounds great, and if you could bring that back and we'll discuss it, and then maybe we can make a motion at the other next meeting. I don't know anything about the fiscal impacts of where the money would come from and how much that is.
I think we would come back with the performance issues that are related to those two, and then if the committee wanted to make a recommendation to the full council, you do it after that.
So you'll bring that back for our review and let the minutes reflect that?
Or if you, okay.
Okay.
I think that way we'll include it to the full council to know that you're looking at that issue and you will review it after 6 months.
Could you just put in the CAR that there was a discussion about?
Okay, yeah.
I think that will work.
And then the other thing, just because of the comments about the economy, we have, the staff here, we've been through several recessions, some of us all the way back to Prop 13, and
Me too.
we're very concerned about the revenues and where the housing market's going and its impact on revenues. And I can assure you that we will, with every monthly report coming to the council and to the finance committee, be talking about those. And if revenues go downward, we will be making adjustments to the organization because we are very concerned about the next 2-year fiscal plan, and we think we've gotten through this and we're in pretty good shape. But if revenues decline, we're going to need to make adjustments, and we are not going to have time to wait until July 1st of 2009 to do
Yeah.
that. We need to prepare the organization. So we're acutely aware of that.
Sounds good. Okay, any further comments for the good of the cause here? If not, then we'll adjourn the meeting of May 28th. Thank everybody for coming.